So we finished up chapter 5 today, and I think it's safe to say this was more involved than chapter 4. So I'm going to get right to it. And I'm going to start off with Cortez, who to me is the quintessential figure of this time, where we have Europeans getting in boats, traveling to places in the world they had not been prior, and interacting with the indigenous people with all sorts of outcomes happening. So Cortez left Spain, goes to the Aztec Empire, which is in modern day Mexico, and spread Spanish colonialism where he traveled. Now, he is one of many, but to me, he's the poster child of this era. And it was a very unpleasant outcome for the indigenous people. When these new arrivals showed up, many of them died from smallpox. They had a very different immune system than those who were traveling over, who had stronger immune systems based on surviving the bubonic plague or their family surviving the bubonic plague 150 years prior. And if you look at some of the numbers, 95% death rate, and it wasn't all smallpox. Smallpox was the main killer, but there was old-fashioned shootings and violence in conjunction with a lot of other diseases like measles. Real tragedy. And when you combine the Great Dying with the Little Ice Age, it was a rough time. The weather, on a very simple level, weather will dictate history on a very simple level. And the Little Ice Age caused food shortages. And when you have food shortages, it becomes problematic. People starve, people get sick, immune systems go down. Now, probably the number one group that was affected was the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty in China was poised to take over the world. Really, they had all the pieces in place, and they got hit with a couple rough weather years. And instead of taking over the world, they faced starvation. So, weather always wins in history on a very simple level as a theme. Now, general crisis is a very AP term. In all the years I taught regular history, I've never used this term, but AP is a little bit different. And it's a term coined by some historians to explain the mess that was going on during this time, this sense of problems. And if you put this with the Little Ice Age, with the general crisis, essentially we have some problems that we need to fix here. And the way the Europeans fixed their economic problems was imperialism and colonialism. Because if they're suffering at home economically, hey, I'm going to get on a boat, go to some place, and take their wealth. I can fix that crisis. Now, this might be the biggest game changer in history. One of the biggest game changers is Christopher Columbus. You could make an argument 1492 was the most important year in world history because it made the world global. Okay, this is this distinction between the quote unquote old world before Columbus and the new world after Columbus. You can have this demarcation of, we have BC and AD. Really, you could do BC and AC, before Columbus and after Columbus. And what happened was this exchange where commodities and sicknesses and diseases and animals went from this part of the world to this part of the world and vice versa. Somewhere in China, there's Chinese guy having a potato chip and a smoke. Okay, that was not from his neck of the woods. And somewhere there is an American person having a banana and a cup of coffee for breakfast. Okay, that was not from our part of the world. But if you look at these commodities, these are all multi-billion-dollar industries, and the diseases that came over that affected people, the animals and the plants. This is the global world. This is the demarcation. Notice I've been talking about this one for a long time. This is a biggie. This is a game changer. Columbian Exchange. Hopefully you learned about that in class. Now, mercantilism is an economic idea where these European countries realize that I can go to a place and I can take their wealth and then force them to buy my goods. It's essentially a bad relationship where if you're ever in a bad relationship and somebody gives and gives and gives and the other person takes and takes and takes, mercantilism is Europe taking and taking and taking. Europe becomes very wealthy, and those they were colonizing and taking the raw materials and forcing them to buy European products. suffered economically, but this was the economic engine of this time that related to the Columbian Exchange. Again, if you look at all these commodities, well, I have to sell these commodities. Okay, I'm going to take over a place and make them buy my stuff. That's how you become very wealthy. Okay, now this one's a little more sociological. It's this notion of race. And I know you're saying, hey, race, isn't that more sociology, not history? You're right. However, this notion of modern race, you could make an argument, again, that's what AP is all about, that really modern racial paradigms started with the Spanish, with their hierarchy or their casta. And whatever your genetic makeup was, is where you fit into society, ranging from the top, which is both Spanish parents, to all the way at the bottom. You had both African parents to the ones in between, where you had Spanish mixed with indigenous. So, on a deeper level, it's kind of the beginning of racial paradigms of racism, that there's a pecking order based upon your blood, and it established, in the sense, a caste system in the Americas. And then we see these things like social Darwinism, this idea like, hey, survival of the fittest applies to the animal world, it applies for people. Why are we running the show? Because we're smarter, we're better, that sort of thing. And it spread through a lot of different countries. And you can make an argument we still are living in a very racially divided world. You can make the argument it started with the Costa, and you can then make the argument it hasn't improved or it has improved. Start thinking about these sorts of arguments, because they're going to pay off when you take the test in May. Okay, settler colonies. Now, settler colonies, there was so much moving around. What happened were these big groups of people would leave the mother country and set up shop in a new country, and it almost became, I don't want to say like a copy of it, but it became like an outpost of that. An example is Australia. Australia, they unloaded a bunch of British people into Australia, and it has a lot of the language and a lot of the customs. And we see these settler colonies. Let me scale to something smaller. If you've ever been to a major city and there's ethnic enclaves, you go to a Chinatown or a Little Italy, it's that kind of vibe. And these popped up all over the world during this age of exploration. Now, Russia started becoming really big. Okay, Russia just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's been nothing in history as big as Russia. So, the glue that kept the Russian Empire together was Orthodox Christianity. That was the great unifier. Now, economically, the soft gold, okay, which is a nickname for fur. Fur is big money, and the Russians were great at acquiring it and selling it and that sort of thing. And then they had a yasak, now, which was a tribute that Imperial Russia, as they were expanding, they took a tax from all of these people. Now, it's not that different than now. With my paycheck, I pay a tax to the state of Michigan, I pay it to the United States, that sort of thing. But between the soft gold, this fur trade, and these tributes, Russia was a lot able to expand to what it was. Now, we see other expansion with the Qing expansion. Now, the Qing dynasty, we see a huge population boom in China. And then we see this assimilation to China, essentially China becoming medium China to big bad China, okay? And it got really big. Now, there was a stretch in the 19th century where China had a very, very rough time. But the Qing expansion is, we're seeing China becoming a bigger and bigger world player. And, with 5,000 years of history, there's been times China's been on top, times that they've been on the bottom, times they've been in the middle. Now, another empire emerged from the Indian subcontinent, the Mughal. And the Mughal, you can see this Taj Mahal. Okay, now to me, it's the most beautiful building ever. And it's a very romantic story that it was built as a mausoleum for the emperor's wife who died in childbirth. And he wanted to create the most beautiful building in the world as an expression of love. But in addition to this incredible art, these were some tough people. These were people that had cannons and all sorts of weapons. And this was a big, powerful empire. But let's fast forward a little bit. If you look at the Indian subcontinent, they had a partition where they divided up. So with Bangladesh and Pakistan being primarily Islamic, India being primarily Hindu. It really stemmed from this Mughal Empire, this intermixing of Islam with Hindu. And that's been a contentious issue and a very fluid issue in the subcontinent for some time. Okay. Now, these Mughal leaders, Akbar, Aurangzeb, these were the way they got leadership. It was a lot of like assassinations and infighting and that sort of thing. But these were powerful, powerful guys. Well, I'll tell you one thing about the Mughals. They had a quarter of the world's gems, which helps in the money department. Okay. Now, the Ottoman, this is a huge, long lasting, hold on, 1299 and 1923. Absolutely a monstrously powerful, huge Islamic empire known as a gunpowder empire. And we learned about them in class. And if you look at this part of the world, still very Islamic from their influence. And the Devshirme was a system that the Muslims would take Christian children, and you had to give up X amount of your children if you lived in the Ottoman Empire. And these children were forced to convert to Islam and become slaves. Now, it was interesting. Some of these kids went on to become very powerful in their own right. So, I know the Russians had their tribute. This is a little bit of a stronger tribute, but the moral of the story is when you are a dominant empire with hegemony, you tend to make money. The rich get richer, the poor get poor. Let's keep it simple. The rich get richer, the poor get poor, and you're able to have the power and the hegemony to do these sorts of things to maintain that. Okay, so that was chapter 5. Hopefully, that was a doable chapter. Hopefully, you're starting to think more in argumentative sorts of terms because it will pay off come May. So, thank you for watching.